The smell hit me first. Fresh concrete where my kitchen used to be. 18 months fighting in Afghanistan, and I come home to find HOA President Bryce Ashworth had illegally sold my family's 3,500-acre Missouri farm, used forged documents and fake road assessments while I was deployed with no way to defend myself. Where my great-grandfather's farmhouse stood since 1897, a shiny sign announced, Willowbrook Country Club, grand opening soon. His Depression-era apple orchard, now a yellow-striped parking lot. I sat in my truck laughing until my ribs ached, the broken kind when your brain can't process how completely someone just destroyed your life. 18 months bleeding for freedom while some suburban parasite erased my bloodline with fraudulent paperwork. But here's what Bryce didn't know about this simple farm boy. I'd learned a few things overseas about patience, strategy, and finding your enemy's weak spots. What would you do if a neighbor's fraud wiped out 4 generations overnight? Where are you watching from, and what's your breaking point? Because what I discovered buried in those courthouse records didn't just get my farm back. It destroyed Bryce's entire world, and I mean everything. My name's Ezra Thornfield, and before this nightmare started, I was just another farm kid who joined the Army to see something beyond Missouri cornfields. Turns out Afghanistan's got plenty of dust too, but at least over there you know who's shooting at you. The Thornfield farm began in 1897, when great-grandfather Silas homesteaded 3,500 acres of prime Missouri bottomland. Survived the Civil War aftermath, the Dust Bowl that killed half our neighbors, and the Depression when Grandpa Jeremiah hand-grafted apple trees because buying food was pure fantasy. Dad kept it running until a John Deere rolled on him when I was 19. Mom remarried some insurance salesman and fled to Florida faster than a cat with its tail on fire, leaving me the choice. Sell 4 generations of blood and sweat, or figure out how to keep it alive while serving my country. The smell of diesel fuel mixing with morning coffee in our farmhouse kitchen, the rough bark of century-old oak trees under my palms, the sweet scent of apple blossoms that made surviving Missouri winters worthwhile, the crunch of gravel under boots as I walked property lines I'd memorized since I could walk. I locked every detail in my memory before shipping out, never imagining I'd need them as evidence to prove what was rightfully mine. When deployment orders came through, I arranged for Cletus Bramwell, our 73-year-old neighbor who'd been farming since Eisenhower was president, to keep watch. Simple deal. Feed the cattle, maintain the equipment, call me if anything seemed off with the property or if any strangers started sniffing around asking questions. What could possibly go wrong, right? Enter Bryce Ashworth, age 52, professional parasite, and human vulture. This Atlanta transplant had gotten rich flipping foreclosed homes during the 2008 housing crisis, basically profiting off other families' misery and desperation. Moved to Missouri 5 years ago, bought the biggest house in the new Willowbrook Subdivision, then immediately ran for HOA president, promising to maintain community standards and enhance property values through responsible governance. Translation: make everyone else's life absolutely miserable while padding his own bank account and feeding his power-hungry ego. Picture this jackass, polo shirts in January snowstorms, white BMW with developer vanity plates carrying around a 47-page HOA rulebook that regulated everything from mailbox colors to acceptable seasonal decorations and appropriate vehicular parking orientations. He'd literally measure your grass with a ruler and fine you $50 if it hit 3 inches instead of regulation 2.5. The kind of suburban Napoleon who peaked in high school student government and never got over the rush of controlling people. 3 weeks after I returned from deployment, still adjusting to sleeping without mortar rounds for background noise, I marched into his strip mall office, squeezed between a nail salon reeking of acetone and a pizza ranch where the grease smell could stop a charging rhino, demanding to know what the hell had happened to my family's farm. Bryce didn't even look up from his precious color-coded charts and laminated organizational systems. Mr. Thornfield, your property accumulated $47,000 in road maintenance assessments and community improvement fees. We followed all proper legal procedures and statutory requirements. My land was never part of your subdivision, I said, probably louder than necessary. That's when he finally looked up and gave me the smile. That practiced, condescending smirk of someone who'd perfected the art of screwing people over while staying technically within legal boundaries. The 1987 County Master Plan shows different boundary designations than what you might remember. We provided proper legal notice through certified mail, followed all correct procedural requirements. Perhaps maintaining better communication with local governmental authorities would have prevented this unfortunate misunderstanding. I was deployed in Afghanistan serving my country. Personal circumstances don't excuse civic obligations, Mr. Thornfield. Maybe next time you'll think twice before abandoning your responsibilities. That last line hit me like a mortar blast. This piece of shit had just called 18 months of military service abandoning responsibilities. Right then, staring at his smug face, I knew exactly what kind of predator I was dealing with, someone who'd specifically targeted military families knowing we couldn't fight back from 8,000 miles away. Walking out, I saw my grandfather's initials carved in that doomed apple tree, JT 1934, and made a promise that would have made the old man proud. Bryce thought he'd won by stealing from a deployed soldier. He had no idea he'd just declared war on the wrong goddamn family. Bryce wasted no time showing me exactly what kind of monster I was dealing with. The very next morning, I woke up to find a sheriff's deputy standing in what used to be my driveway, holding a piece of paper that might as well have been a death sentence. Mr. Thornfield, I'm serving you with an official trespassing notice. You're no longer permitted on this property. I stared at the document, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from pure rage. The paper felt flimsy between my fingers, like tissue that could change a century of family history. This is my family's land! The deputy, a young kid who looked embarrassed as hell, just shrugged. According to county records, sir, this property belongs to the Willowbrook HOA. I'm sorry, but if you don't leave immediately, I'll have to arrest you. Behind him, Bryce's white BMW pulled up with that distinctive purr of German engineering bought with stolen money. The bastard stepped out wearing a shit-eating grin that made my trigger finger itch, his polo shirt pressed crisp enough to cut glass. Mr. Thornfield, I tried to handle this diplomatically, but you forced my hand. The Willowbrook Golf Course development is a legally authorized project worth $2.3 million. We can't have unstable individuals interfering with legitimate business operations. Unstable individuals? The words came out as a growl. Well, we've all heard stories about veterans coming home with issues, PTSD, anger management problems, difficulty adjusting to civilian authority. I'm sure you understand my concern for community safety. That's when I noticed the second cop car pulling up. And the third. Bryce had brought his own little army, including, and this made my blood boil, Deputy Rick Ashworth, Bryce's brother-in-law, wearing a badge and family loyalty that apparently trumped any oath to serve and protect. Ezra, Rick said, not quite meeting my eyes. Just walk away, son. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. But I wasn't about to roll over. That night, I camped out at the county courthouse, pulling every record I could find dating back to 1897. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, and the musty smell of old paper and forgotten justice filled my nostrils as I dug through deed transfers, survey maps, and incorporation documents. My grandfather had always told me, son, when someone tries to steal from you legal-like, you better know the law better than they do. Turns out agricultural land has special protections most folks never hear about. Missouri's right to farm statute shields farming operations from residential interference, but you've got to file paperwork within 30 days or lose your chance forever. The real treasure was buried in Bryce's own documents. The slick bastard had filed Willowbrook as a residential community, but his golf course was clearly commercial development. I remembered reading somewhere that state law requires unanimous homeowner consent for residential HOAs to go commercial. Guess what golden boy Bryce never bothered to get? By dawn, I had my ammunition. I called Judith Blackwater, a Cherokee Nation lawyer who specialized in land rights cases. Something about her voice told me she understood what it meant to fight for stolen ground. By noon, we'd filed an emergency injunction citing agricultural protection statutes and unauthorized commercial development. That's when Bryce made his first real mistake. He got desperate. 2 hours later, a local news crew showed up at the courthouse. The reporter, a blonde 20-something who clearly got her information straight from Bryce's spin machine, shoved a microphone in my face like she was trying to start a fight. Mr. Thornfield, how do you respond to allegations that you're using your military service to avoid legitimate property obligations? The urge to grab that microphone and introduce it to her digestive system was overwhelming, but Judith squeezed my shoulder. No comment, she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought bigger battles than this. But we'll have plenty to say when all the facts come out. That evening, I created a Facebook group called Save Thornfield Farm. The response shocked me. Within 24 hours, 847 people had joined, including 14 other families across the county who'd suffered similar questionable property seizures by various HOAs. Messages poured in like water through a broken dam. Turned out Bryce's little scam was just the tip of a very ugly iceberg. The smell of apple blossoms drifted through my truck windows as I sat in what used to be my driveway that night, reading story after story. Veterans who'd served overseas only to find their property legally stolen. Elderly farmers pressured into selling prime land for pennies. Families destroyed by bureaucratic warfare they never saw coming. But mixed with the heartbreak was something else. Pure, focused anger from people ready to fight back. Bryce thought he was dealing with one pissed-off veteran. He was about to discover he'd started a war with an entire community that was sick to death of watching predators like him feast on everything good about small-town America. The real battle was just beginning, and this time, I wasn't fighting alone. Bryce's retaliation came fast and vicious, like a cornered rat with a law degree and a persecution complex. Within 48 hours of my injunction filing, I got slammed with more legal paperwork than a tax audit from hell. First came the nuisance lawsuit. Apparently my agricultural activities violated county noise ordinances. According to Bryce's complaint, my 1987 John Deere tractor created excessive decibel levels during prohibited hours, disturbing the peaceful enjoyment of Willowbrook residents. This from a guy whose leaf blower routine every Saturday morning sounded like a jet engine having a nervous breakdown. My tractor's top speed of 15 miles per hour made it about as threatening as a golf cart with arthritis. Then the environmental agency showed up. Some anonymous tipster had reported improper manure management and potential groundwater contamination on my property. I watched 3 state inspectors in hazmat suits trudge through my pastures with clipboards, taking soil samples like they were investigating a nuclear meltdown instead of a family farm that had been operating cleanly since William McKinley was president. The smell of their diesel generator mixed with morning dew on grass my cattle had been grazing safely for decades. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were burning fossil fuels to investigate whether cow shit was an environmental hazard. But the real gut punch came during the county commissioners' meeting. Bryce had lobbied them to reclassify my land as blighted residential property requiring immediate development intervention. He stood at that podium in his crisp white shirt and power tie, painting my farm as some kind of environmental disaster and public safety menace. Commissioners, we have an opportunity to transform an underutilized agricultural parcel into a world-class recreational facility that will bring jobs, tourism revenue, and increased property values to our community, he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. We can't let one individual's resistance to progress hold back economic development that will benefit everyone. The bastard was good. Made it sound like I was some backwards hillbilly standing in the way of prosperity when really he was just trying to flip stolen land for an $8 million profit. Meanwhile, Judith was doing her own investigation, and what she uncovered made my blood run cold. Bryce's development company owed $890,000 in back taxes across 3 states. His ex-wife from Atlanta owned Prestige Golf Course Design, the same company that had mysteriously won the Willowbrook contract without competitive bidding. Most damning of all, public records showed Bryce had been systematically targeting military families during deployments for 4 years. Back in Afghanistan, we'd learned that when you're hunting predators, you follow the money trail. It always leads to their nest. Bryce's financial web was starting to unravel, and each thread we pulled revealed more corruption. That's when Dorothy, the county clerk who'd worked there since Nixon was president, pulled me aside after one of my research marathons. "Ezra," she whispered, glancing around like the walls had ears, "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but the Willowbrook HOA hasn't filed their required annual corporate reports in 3 years. Technically, their legal status is suspended." My heart nearly stopped. A suspended corporation has zero legal authority to make property decisions, sign contracts, or file lawsuits. Everything Bryce had done, every document signed, every legal action taken, was potentially invalid. But here's where it got twisted. The county attorney, a good old boy named Marcus Hartwell, who happened to be Bryce's regular poker buddy, had been conveniently ignoring this paperwork oversight for years. The Facebook group had exploded to 3,100 members, and the horror stories kept flooding in. Margaret Henley, a retired teacher from inside Willowbrook, had been secretly documenting HOA financial irregularities for 2 years, but stayed quiet because Bryce threatened foreclosure over her excessive garden gnome displays. Calvin Morse, a former bank president, had noticed Bryce's emergency assessments violated state laws but kept his mouth shut to avoid retaliation. Local support was building like storm clouds. Millie's Diner started serving the Thornfield Special, eggs, bacon, and hash browns with proceeds going to my legal fund. The high school history class adopted my farm as their heritage project. The regional newspaper ran a headline that made me grin: Developer versus Veteran. Battle for Missouri's agricultural soul. But Bryce wasn't finished playing dirty. The morning I was scheduled to present evidence to the county commissioners, my phone rang with news that made my stomach drop to my boots. Mr. Thornfield, this is Judge Patricia Whitman's office. Mr. Ashworth has filed an emergency motion requesting court-ordered mental health evaluation. He's claiming your military service created PTSD-related delusions, making you a danger to the community. Standing in grandfather's doomed orchard, listening to chainsaws warming up like mechanical vultures, I realized Bryce had just made his biggest mistake yet. He'd crossed the line from theft to character assassination. Time to show this suburban parasite what happens when you declare war on the wrong goddamn family. Bryce's desperation stank worse than a hog farm in August heat. When legal intimidation failed to break me, the son of a bitch decided to get his manicured hands dirty with old-fashioned sabotage. I woke Tuesday morning to the sound of my irrigation system hissing like a punctured tire. Someone had sliced the main lines in 3 places, sending thousands of gallons of precious water flooding uselessly into drainage ditches. In the middle of Missouri's worst drought in 15 years, watching that water disappear was like pouring liquid gold down a storm drain. The apple orchard my grandfather had nursed through the Dust Bowl was already showing stress, brown edges creeping across leaves that should have been emerald green, fruit dropping prematurely from branches that had never failed in 90 years. The sweet smell of ripening apples was being replaced by the acrid odor of dying trees and the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. But agricultural terrorism was just Bryce's warm-up act. Anonymous complaints started flooding the county health department like spam emails from hell. Contaminated wells, diseased livestock, rodent infestations, improper waste disposal. All complete horseshit, but each accusation required expensive testing and professional inspection to officially disprove. Poor Gerald Pitts, the county health inspector, showed up 3 times in 1 week looking like a man being forced to kick puppies. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornfield," he said, adjusting his glasses while studying his shoes. "I know this is harassment, but I have to test your stock pond again. Someone reported seeing dead fish." "Gerald, you tested that pond Monday. Those fish are healthier than most Willowbrook residents." I know, but if I don't follow procedure, my boss will have my head on his desk by Friday." The bureaucratic harassment was like Chinese water torture, individually meaningless but collectively designed to drive me insane and drain my bank account. Meanwhile, Bryce organized his Willowbrook Safety Committee, which was basically a support group for paranoid suburban moms, armed with professionally printed signs reading, "Protect our children from agricultural hazards." These people had moved to the country for that authentic rural lifestyle, but wanted to eliminate any actual farming from their Instagram-worthy views. That's when my trail cameras started earning their keep. I'd hidden them throughout the property after the irrigation sabotage, tucked into fence posts and tree hollows like electronic snipers. Thursday night, they caught pure gold. Bryce's nephew Tyler, a 20-something trust fund baby, tampering with my tractor's hydraulic lines. The footage was prosecutors' dream perfect. Tyler's acne-scarred face illuminated by his iPhone flashlight as he loosened fuel fittings and poured what looked suspiciously like sugar into my tank. Even better, the timestamp showed this happening during one of Bryce's documented business trips to Kansas City, giving Uncle Scumbag plausible deniability. But my real breakthrough came from playing detective. Using surveillance techniques learned overseas, I started mapping Bryce's routines, tracking his movements, identifying patterns that revealed the true scope of his operation. Back in Afghanistan, we'd learned that successful missions start with understanding your enemy's weaknesses, and boy, did Bryce have weaknesses. What I uncovered made my grandfather's stolen farm look like petty theft. Bryce had been systematically targeting agricultural properties across 5 counties, using identical legal loopholes and bureaucratic weapons. Over $12 million in stolen farmland, all converted to suburban developments in just 4 years. The bastard had turned rural exploitation into a goddamn assembly line. His hunting strategy was particularly vicious. He specifically targeted families during vulnerable moments like military deployments, elderly deaths, medical emergencies, divorce proceedings. Anytime property owners couldn't defend themselves became Christmas morning for Bryce's vulture capitalism. When I hired Margaret Williams, a forensic accountant Judith recommended, her findings exceeded my worst nightmares. Bryce wasn't just stealing land. He was running a pyramid scheme with HOA funds, using embezzled maintenance fees to finance new property acquisitions. My grandfather always said, "Follow the money, boy. Thieves always leave a paper trail if you know where to look." The golf course project wasn't theft. It was Bryce's exit strategy. Sell to a major developer for $8 million, then vanish before his financial house of cards collapsed, leaving 247 homeowners holding worthless properties and massive legal debts. Friday morning brought his nuclear option, an emergency court motion claiming my farm posed imminent public health threats requiring immediate government seizure. He'd fabricated an entire environmental study showing groundwater contamination, complete with forged lab results and fake expert signatures. The hearing was set for Tuesday, the same day as his planned golf course groundbreaking. Maximum humiliation while cameras rolled and investors applauded. But sitting in my truck that evening, watching sunset paint my great-grandfather's land in shades of gold and crimson, I realized Bryce had finally made the fatal mistake I'd been waiting for. His fake environmental report claimed contamination from agricultural runoff, but the lab results were dated 2 weeks before my irrigation system was sabotaged. How do you test contaminated runoff from a farm that had no water? Time to bury this suburban parasite with his own shovel. The night before the court hearing, I was drowning in legal documents when Judith called with news that changed everything. Her voice had that electric tension you hear when someone strikes oil. "Ezra, get down to my office right now. I found something in Willowbrook's original incorporation papers that's going to blow this case to smithereens." I drove through empty streets with my heart hammering like a tripwire explosive, wondering what could be urgent enough to drag me out at 11 p.m. Judith's law office sat above Murphy's antique shop on Main Street, her windows glowing like a beacon of hope in the Missouri darkness. I found her surrounded by coffee cups and legal documents spread across every surface like evidence from a murder investigation. "Look at this buried treasure," she said, pointing to a yellow document that looked older than dirt. Clause 47B in Willowbrook HOA's original 1985 Articles of Incorporation. I leaned over her shoulder, squinting at faded typewriter text while the musty smell of old paper mixed with stale coffee and the sweet scent of impending victory. Any property development project affecting regional water rights or designated agricultural preserve areas requires written approval from 75% of all property owners within the affected watershed district. I read aloud, the words feeling like magic spells. What the hell does that mean in English? Judith's grin could have powered the entire county courthouse. It means Bryce's golf course plan was never legally submitted for required environmental impact review. But here's the beautiful part. The affected watershed doesn't just include Willowbrook's 247 properties. According to the 1985 County Water Management Plan, it encompasses 847 properties across 3 entire townships. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting. So he needed approval from 847 property owners to legally proceed with any development affecting the watershed. He got approval from exactly 0. Not even his own HOA board voted on this. The magnitude hit me like incoming artillery. What had seemed like David versus Goliath was actually me holding enough legal ammunition to level Bryce's entire empire. His golf course project didn't just violate forged boundaries. It violated the HOA's own founding documents in ways that made his previous crimes look like jaywalking tickets. But the revelation kept getting sweeter. My spring-fed property sat at the headwaters of the regional aquifer, the underground river system supplying drinking water to over 12,000 residents across 3 counties. Golf course chemical treatments would contaminate the source for half of eastern Missouri, giving me federal standing under the Clean Water Act to halt any development indefinitely. Sweet Jesus, I whispered, finally understanding the true scope of Bryce's attempted environmental vandalism. This isn't just theft, it's mass poisoning with a country club twist. Judith nodded grimly, her Cherokee heritage giving her a particular appreciation for land theft disguised as progress. One phone call to EPA would trigger federal investigation shutting down not just the golf course, but freezing all development in Willowbrook pending contamination studies. Bryce would face criminal charges under federal environmental protection statutes, We're talking potential prison time. The power reversal was so complete it made my head spin. 24 hours ago, I'd been a desperate veteran fighting impossible odds with nothing but rage and stubbornness. Now I was holding enough legal dynamite to crater Bryce's operation, bankrupt his investors, and possibly send him to federal prison where polo shirts aren't standard attire. But as the implications crystallized, the moral complexity became unavoidable. Triggering federal investigation would stop Bryce's corruption and protect the watershed, but it would also destroy property values for 247 innocent homeowners who'd invested their life savings in his promises. Retirees, young families, teachers, nurses, working people who'd trusted the American dream to a suburban sociopath. There's more, Judith continued, spreading Margaret's forensic accounting reports like tarot cards predicting financial doom. Bryce has been using homeowner equity as collateral for his development loans. If the golf course project fails, the bank can foreclose on the entire subdivision. Every single house becomes bank property. The pyramid scheme's true evil became clear. Bryce hadn't just stolen my land. He'd transformed 247 families into unwitting co-conspirators in his criminal enterprise. When his house of cards collapsed, they'd lose everything while he vanished with millions to some non-extradition paradise. But here's where it gets interesting, Judith said, producing a handwritten list that looked like a resistance movement roster. Some Willowbrook homeowners have been secretly organizing. Margaret Henley reached out through back channels. Calvin Morse has been building a coalition of residents who suspect Bryce's corruption but were afraid to speak openly. 14 names: teachers, mechanics, retirees, small business owners, who'd been quietly documenting unauthorized assessments, questioning missing maintenance funds, noticing that board meetings violated state sunshine laws. Ordinary people who'd invested everything in their homes and slowly realized they'd been conned by a master manipulator. They want to partner with us, Judith explained. Remove Bryce through legitimate homeowner vote, restructure HOA finances transparently, void the fraudulent golf course contract. They understand their homes become worthless if his scheme collapses publicly. Sitting there at midnight, surrounded by evidence of corruption deeper than Missouri topsoil, I faced a choice that would define not just my victory, but my character. Destroy Bryce with federal charges and collateral damage to innocents, or build a coalition that protected families while still delivering justice. Tomorrow's hearing had evolved beyond personal revenge into something that could reshape how communities fight corporate predators. Bryce thought he was battling one pissed-off veteran. He was about to discover he'd declared war on 847 property owners, federal environmental law, and the unstoppable force of rural Missouri when it finally gets mad enough to fight back. The next morning, Cletus's barn became our war room. The smell of hay and old leather mixed with fresh coffee as our unlikely coalition gathered around a folding table that looked like it had survived both world wars. Margaret Henley arrived first, a silver-haired retired teacher who'd spent 40 years taming teenage bullies and wasn't about to let some middle-aged suburban tyrant intimidate her now. Calvin Morse followed, a former bank president whose handshake could crack walnuts and whose knowledge of financial law made Bryce's accounting tricks look like a kid's lemonade stand. 14 other Willowbrook residents trickled in, teachers, mechanics, nurses, retirees, all united by the discovery that their trusted HOA president had been robbing them blind. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, looking around at faces that represented everything decent about small-town Missouri, "we're not just fighting for my farm anymore. We're dismantling a criminal enterprise that's been stealing from hardworking families for 4 years." Judith spread out our battle plan like a general preparing for Normandy. "We're going nuclear with 5 simultaneous tracks," she explained, her Cherokee lawyer instincts sharp as flint arrowheads. Track 1, challenge HOA authority using their suspended corporate status. Track 2, prove document forgery and boundary alterations. Track 3, trigger federal watershed investigation. Track 4, file embezzlement charges forcing complete financial audit. Track 5, organize emergency homeowner vote removing Bryce from power. Calvin adjusted his reading glasses, studying documents with the intensity of a man who'd spent 30 years spotting financial fraud before breakfast. "Here's something that would have saved my neighbors a fortune," he said, his banker's wisdom cutting through legal jargon. "Most homeowners don't realize they can demand receipts and contractor bids for any HOA assessment over $500. If the board can't produce them immediately, you've probably caught them stealing. My grandfather always said the best lessons come from other people's mistakes. How many American families were getting robbed by HOA boards simply because they didn't know their basic property rights? Margaret pulled out a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. 2 years of meticulously documented financial irregularities that would make a CPA weep. Bryce's unauthorized special assessments total $340,000, she said, her voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who'd dedicated her retirement to catching a thief. Money that disappeared into his development company for projects that were either never completed or never existed. Derivative lawsuits are beautiful things, Calvin explained, warming to his subject like a preacher finding his rhythm. When HOA board members mismanage finances, homeowners can sue them personally for every penny lost. Prove breach of fiduciary duty, and Bryce becomes personally liable for his entire pyramid scheme, including that tax debt he's been dodging like a deadbeat dad. The legal noose was tightening around Bryce's neck, but we needed more than lawyers and accountants to win hearts and minds. Media blitz, I announced, pulling out my phone to show Facebook statistics that looked like election poll numbers. Save Thornfield Farm hit 15,000 members overnight. Channel 7 wants courthouse interviews. The Kansas City Star is planning a 3-part expose on HOA corruption statewide. We coordinate maximum publicity during the hearing to pressure county officials who've been covering Bryce's ass. Margaret's eyes lit up with the joy of someone who'd spent decades organizing school fundraisers and PTA battles. The high school kids want to create a heritage display about your family's farm for the courthouse steps. Nothing says American values like teenagers defending agricultural history against corporate greed. But our secret weapon was sitting in the corner, quietly organizing what he called Operation Combine Harvest. Cletus had been working his phone like a campaign manager, mobilizing every farmer within a 100-mile radius. 250 tractors, grain trucks, and combines, he announced with the satisfaction of a man whose friendships had been 50 years in the making. Convoy escort to the courthouse, plus free lunch at 3 local diners for anyone showing support. I could picture it. Bryce's pristine BMW surrounded by John Deeres older than his mortgage, suburban arrogance dwarfed by agricultural reality that had been feeding America since before his great-grandfather was born. Emma's been cooking all morning, Cletus added with a grin. Says any woman who can feed a church potluck can damn sure feed a revolution. From the kitchen came Emma's voice, seasoned with 70 years of Missouri sass. You boys quit planning and start eating before this bacon gets colder than Bryce's heart. The contingency planning was military-grade thorough. If the hearing failed, EPA complaints got filed within an hour. If Bryce tried fleeing, our private investigator was tracking assets across state lines. If homeowners panicked about property values, honest HOA leadership was ready for installation faster than a cable repair. As our strategy session wound down, Margaret leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades teaching life lessons to ungrateful teenagers. You know what's beautiful about this whole mess? Bryce thought he could pick off families one by one. Deployments, deaths, divorces, disasters, classic predator behavior. But he never imagined us actually talking to each other. Wolves hunt isolated sheep, Calvin agreed. They run when the flock fights back. Sitting in that barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and the sound of good people planning justice, I understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me years ago. Real strength doesn't come from individual heroics. It comes from communities deciding they're not going to take any more shit from bullies. Tomorrow's hearing wasn't just about legal victory. It was about proving that ordinary Americans could still defeat corporate predators when they stopped fighting alone and started fighting smart. Bryce's desperation reached full-blown psychotic breakdown by 3 a.m. the night before our court hearing. I woke to the rumble of diesel engines and hydraulic whining. The bastard had bribed a construction crew to start golf course groundbreaking under cover of darkness, hoping to create irreversible progress before any judge could stop him. I threw on yesterday's clothes and raced to my property, arriving to find 3 excavators and a bulldozer already tearing into my grandfather's century-old vegetable garden like mechanical vultures feasting on family history. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the sweet scent of destroyed tomato plants and crushed cucumber vines, creating a nauseating cocktail that made my stomach churn with pure rage. "Hey!" I shouted at the crew foreman, a beer-gutted man in a safety vest who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on God's green earth. "This is private property." "Sorry, buddy," he said, studying his boots instead of my eyes. "We got work orders and a cash bonus to finish by sunrise. Boss says it's all legal and above board." Legal my ass. I called the sheriff's department, knowing it was about as useful as asking a fox to guard the henhouse. Deputy Rick Ashworth answered with all the enthusiasm of a man being forced to investigate his own brother-in-law for federal crimes. "Ezra, I can't do nothing without a court order. You know that." "Rick, they're destroying evidence. This is criminal trespass and federal environmental crime." "Look, son, I got paperwork saying they have proper authorization. My hands are tied until a judge says different." But I wasn't fighting alone anymore. My phone started buzzing with emergency notifications as Cletus activated our response network. Within 30 minutes, 15 John Deere tractors formed a convoy down the county road, their headlights cutting through pre-dawn darkness like a mechanized cavalry charge that would have made Patton proud. Margaret was live-streaming the illegal construction on Facebook, her 40 years of teaching experience turning night shift workers across Missouri into invested eyewitnesses. "Good morning, everyone. It's 3:47 a.m. and we're watching Bryce Ashworth's hired thugs destroy a century-old family farm under cover of darkness because he knows today's court hearing will expose his crimes." The viewer count climbed past 2,400 as word spread through social media faster than gossip in a small-town diner. Calvin called the state attorney general's emergency hotline, his banker's authority lending credibility as he reported ongoing felony destruction of evidence in a pending federal environmental case. Within an hour, 2 state police cruisers were parked on public road, their occupants taking photographs and notes while carefully staying within legal boundaries. But the construction crew had orders to finish their demolition, and Bryce's cash bonuses were apparently generous enough to overcome any moral qualms about 4 a.m. environmental vandalism. That's when Mother Nature decided to join our legal team. The excavator operator trying to clear my grandfather's apple orchard hit something that made him shut down his machine faster than a pilot ejecting from a burning fighter jet. Water started bubbling up from the ground like the earth was bleeding. "What the holy hell?" he yelled, climbing down to investigate what he'd uncovered. I jogged over, arriving just as he exposed what appeared to be a natural spring feeding into an underground limestone cave system. Crystal clear water bubbled up from depths that probably connected to the county's main aquifer, surrounded by rock formations that looked older than the state of Missouri itself. Shit, the foreman muttered, recognizing environmental disaster when it was staring him in the face. Nobody said nothing about no protected wetlands or underground springs. Protected wetlands. Those 2 words hung in the pre-dawn air like a death sentence for Bryce's entire golf course fantasy. I speed-dialed Judith, and she arrived just as the EPA's emergency response team was cordoning off the area with yellow tape that might as well have read Bryce Ashworth's political obituary. Federal environmental law protects wetlands on private property, and destroying them without permits is a felony that can shut down development projects indefinitely. "This changes everything," Judith whispered, watching federal agents photograph evidence of environmental crimes that would make Superfund lawyers salivate. He just committed federal destruction of protected habitat while under investigation for fraud. That's enough criminal exposure to bury him regardless of what happens in court. The construction crew packed up their equipment faster than teenagers fleeing a house party when parents come home early. The foreman handed me an envelope thick with cash, Bryce's advance payment for the illegal work. "Tell your boss he can kiss this money goodbye," I said, pocketing what would become Exhibit A in federal bribery charges. But Bryce's panic had just shifted into overdrive. By 6 a.m., he was making increasingly frantic phone calls to county officials, demanding immediate judicial intervention to override federal environmental protection. One of those conversations got recorded by a journalist monitoring police scanners, capturing Bryce's voice clearly promising campaign contributions in exchange for favorable court rulings. Margaret's live stream had exploded to over 8,900 viewers watching federal environmental crime documentation in real time. The comments section looked like a digital lynch mob calling for Bryce's immediate arrest and prosecution. "This is what corruption looks like at 4 a.m., Margaret narrated with the moral authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades teaching right from wrong. "When these people think nobody's watching, this is exactly how property thieves operate." Standing in my grandfather's destroyed garden as dawn broke over federal crime scene tape, I realized Bryce had panicked himself into committing felonies that would send him to federal prison for years. But his financial web was so complex that his collapse might destroy hundreds of innocent families who'd trusted their life savings to a suburban sociopath. The court hearing was still 6 hours away, and Bryce Ashworth was already finished. The only question remaining was whether we could save his victims from drowning when his criminal empire finally imploded. The morning of the hearing brought Bryce's final, pathetic Hail Mary, a settlement offer that reeked of desperation and overpriced cologne. He ambushed me at the Comfort Inn breakfast buffet at 7 a.m., flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they'd rather be defending tax evaders than whatever legal abomination their client had become. The smell of burnt coffee and institutional scrambled eggs filled the air as Bryce slid into my booth uninvited, his usual arrogance replaced by the sweaty panic of a man watching his empire crumble in high definition. "Mr. Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying not to hyperventilate, "I think we can resolve this misunderstanding without dragging innocent families through expensive litigation. I'm prepared to offer you $500,000 cash, plus 50 acres of prime agricultural land in Jefferson County, plus full legal fees." I almost choked on my orange juice. "You mean land you don't own yet but plan to steal from some other military family?" His left eye developed a nervous twitch that would have been hilarious under different circumstances. "Plus a written public apology for any inconvenience this boundary survey discrepancy may have caused your family's agricultural operations." Boundary survey discrepancy? The words came out as a growl that made nearby hotel guests look up from their continental breakfast disasters. "You stole my great-grandfather's farm and tried to poison half of Missouri's groundwater. That's not a surveying error. That's organized crime with a golf cart." When I told him to shove his blood money where the sun don't shine, Bryce dropped his mask completely and revealed the sociopathic core that had been driving his criminal enterprise all along. "Fine," he whispered, leaning forward like someone sharing state secrets. "But if I go down, I'm taking everyone with me. Your precious neighbors in Willowbrook will lose everything, every house, every retirement account, every college fund. You want 247 families' financial destruction on your conscience, soldier boy?" The threat hit like a gut punch because it wasn't empty bluster. It was mathematical certainty. Calvin's forensic analysis had revealed that Bryce had structured his pyramid scheme so that his collapse would trigger cascading foreclosures across the entire subdivision. Homeowners who'd never heard of derivatives or cross-collateralized debt would lose their life savings because they'd trusted a suburban con artist with their American dreams. "He's weaponized their mortgages," Calvin had explained with the horrified fascination of someone who'd spent 30 years in banking without seeing anything this evil. "If the golf course project fails, the lender can claim the entire subdivision as collateral. Every mortgage becomes immediately due in full. Families have 30 days to pay off houses or lose everything." Standing in that hotel lobby, watching Bryce's satisfied smirk as he delivered his ultimatum, I faced the moral complexity that separates justice from revenge. I could destroy him with federal environmental charges, but his financial web was so tangled that his destruction would ruin innocent families who'd never supported the land theft. But Judith had discovered a third option that was elegant in its calculated brutality. "We use the environmental violations as leverage," she'd explained. "Force him to surrender everything, transfer stolen properties back to original owners, make full restitution from personal assets, restructure HOA debts to protect homeowners. If he refuses, we release the federal evidence and let criminal prosecution destroy everyone, including himself." The strategy gave Bryce one last chance to minimize damage while still paying the price for his crimes. But his desperation had reached levels that transcended rational self-preservation. By 9 a.m., he was hiring off-duty cops to physically block homeowners from accessing their own subdivision clubhouse, claiming security concerns during the administrative transition period, his euphemism for the hostile takeover he was attempting to prevent. Margaret called with updates that sounded like dispatches from a small-scale civil war. "He's got 3 rent-a-cops with badges blocking the clubhouse entrance," she reported, her teacher's voice vibrating with controlled fury. "Won't let homeowners enter their own community meeting space. Says it's for everyone's safety during this difficult transition." The irony was thicker than Missouri mud. Bryce was holding his own subdivision hostage to prevent democratic removal from power like some tin pot dictator whose coup was failing in real time. But we'd planned for exactly this banana republic bullshit. Calvin organized a parallel homeowner meeting at Jefferson High School's gymnasium, while state police investigated voter intimidation complaints at Willowbrook. By 9:45 a.m., 178 of 247 eligible homeowners had gathered to participate in democracy at its most basic level. The gym smelled like floor wax and teenage angst, filled with families who'd never imagined themselves participating in a political uprising, but found themselves voting to save their financial lives. Margaret stood at a microphone usually reserved for basketball pep rallies, calling the meeting to order with authority earned through 4 decades of managing teenagers and their parents. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice echoing off championship banners, "we're here to remove Bryce Ashworth as HOA president for gross financial mismanagement, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal fraud that threatens every property owner in this community." And the vote was swift and brutal. 162 in favor, 4 opposed, 12 abstentions. Democracy in action, powered by ordinary people who'd finally gotten angry enough to fight back against a suburban tyrant. But even as we celebrated Democratic victory, the courthouse clock was ticking toward 10 a.m., and the hearing that would determine whether our legal system could deliver justice without destroying the innocent victims of one man's greed. Walking toward those courthouse steps where 300-plus supporters were gathering like an army of agricultural righteousness, I realized this battle had evolved beyond personal revenge into something that could reshape how communities fight corporate predators. Bryce thought he'd been playing chess while we played checkers. He was about to discover he'd been playing with dynamite while we'd been building nuclear weapons. The courthouse steps looked like a scene from a rural American revolution. 300 supporters filled the plaza, farmers in work boots, veterans in dress uniforms, families holding homemade signs reading "Justice for Thornfield Farm" and "Stop HOA Corruption." The smell of diesel from idling tractors mixed with fresh coffee from supporters who'd driven hours to witness what everyone sensed would be a landmark moment. Judge Patricia Whitman's courtroom packed beyond fire code limits, with overflow crowds watching on closed-circuit TV in the lobby. She entered with the stern authority of someone who'd spent 30 years sorting truth from legal fiction, her reputation for no-nonsense rulings preceding her like thunder before lightning. Bryce arrived fashionably late in his white BMW, flanked by 3 expensive lawyers who looked like they'd rather be defending corporate tax shelters than whatever legal disaster their client had created. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in public. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Whitman announced, her voice cutting through courtroom chatter like a cleaver through bone, "this is a hearing to determine property ownership, not a public referendum on community development. I'll have order, or I'll clear this courtroom." Bryce's lead attorney opened with textbook legal theater, producing stacks of documents like a magician revealing elaborate tricks. "Your Honor, Mr. Ashworth followed all established legal procedures in addressing Mr. Thornfield's delinquent property assessments. The Willowbrook HOA acted within their corporate authority to recover community debts through proper channels." He painted a picture of responsible civic leadership dealing with an absent property owner who'd abandoned his obligations to serve overseas, making military service sound like a convenient excuse for dodging responsibilities. But Judith's methodical destruction of their case was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, I present the original 1985 HOA Articles of Incorporation, clearly establishing Mr. Thornfield's property as permanent agricultural preserve, exempt from all residential development authority." She laid out documents like evidence at a murder trial. These boundary alterations were unauthorized forgeries violating state property law. Document by document, she dismantled Bryce's entire legal foundation. The county surveyor testified that Bryce had pressured him to alter official maps. The forensic accountant revealed $347,000 in embezzled HOA funds. Margaret presented 2 years of documented financial irregularities that painted Bryce as either grossly incompetent or deliberately criminal. Then came the environmental expert's testimony that made courtroom spectators gasp audibly. "Your Honor, the proposed golf course development would contaminate the regional aquifer supplying drinking water to over 12,000 residents. Federal law prohibits any development threatening protected watersheds." But the real bombshell arrived when FBI agent Sarah Lucy took the witness stand, her federal credentials lending weight that made everyone sit up straighter. "Your Honor, our investigation has revealed a pattern of property seizure targeting military families across 5 counties. Mr. Ashworth's organization has systematically exploited deployment periods to acquire agricultural land through questionable legal procedures. We're recommending federal charges for organized fraud and environmental crimes." The courtroom erupted in murmurs that Judge Whitman silenced with one sharp bang of her gavel. That's when Bryce finally snapped under pressure that had been building for months. Unable to refute mounting evidence, he launched into personal attacks that destroyed whatever credibility remained. "Your Honor, this is nothing but a disturbed veteran's revenge fantasy," he shouted, his composure evaporating like morning dew. "Everyone knows these people come back from war with serious mental problems. PTSD, anger issues, inability to accept civilian authority. I'm protecting this community from someone who clearly can't handle losing." Judge Whitman warned him twice about courtroom behavior, but Bryce was past caring about legal decorum. His lawyer tried desperately to distance himself as his client became increasingly unhinged, making wild accusations about military entitlement and veteran privilege that made spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Order," Judge Whitman commanded. "Mr. Ashworth, you will control yourself or be removed from these proceedings." But the damage was done. In 60 seconds of public meltdown, Bryce had revealed the contempt and prejudice driving his crimes, destroying any sympathy he might have retained. When community testimony began, the real power of our coalition became clear. Calvin explained how Bryce's unauthorized debts threatened every homeowner's financial security. Margaret detailed years of financial mismanagement and intimidation tactics. 14 Willowbrook residents testified they'd never voted to approve any golf course development. Then came the veterans. Commander Jake Morrison from the local VFW spoke about military families' property rights with the authority of someone who'd fought overseas and understood what service meant. "Your Honor, targeting military families during deployment isn't business. It's predatory behavior that dishonors everything we've fought to protect." But the most powerful moment came when I finally took the witness stand, wearing my army dress uniform with ribbons that told the story of 18 months in Afghanistan. The courtroom fell silent as I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. "Your Honor, I didn't serve overseas to protect my right to own property. I served to protect everyone's right to live free from corruption and abuse of power." My voice carried across packed benches filled with faces that represented everything good about rural America. This isn't about one farm or one veteran. It's about whether ordinary Americans can trust their legal system to protect them from predators who use bureaucracy as a weapon against working families. I pulled out the document that would end everything, the environmental report Bryce had submitted as evidence, with lab results dated 2 weeks before my irrigation system was sabotaged. "Your Honor, Mr. Ashworth claims agricultural runoff contaminated groundwater, but his test results are dated February 15th. My irrigation system was destroyed March 2nd. How do you test contaminated runoff from a farm with no running water?" The mic drop moment silenced the courtroom completely. Bryce's face went white as his lawyers realized their client had just been caught in perjury that invalidated his entire environmental case. Judge Whitman studied the documents for long minutes, while 300 people held their breath. "Mr. Ashworth," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "this court finds your property transfer null and void due to fraudulent documentation and procedural violations. Mr. Thornfield's property is hereby restored to its rightful owner." The courtroom erupted in cheers that probably shook windows 3 blocks away. "Furthermore," she continued, "evidence of financial crimes and environmental violations will be forwarded to appropriate state and federal authorities for criminal investigation." That's when Bryce made his final, desperate play that revealed just how completely he'd lost touch with reality. "This is a conspiracy!" he screamed, pointing at me like some courtroom prophet of doom. "They're trying to destroy legitimate development to protect backward agricultural interests. I'll appeal this to the Supreme Court if necessary." "Mr. Ashworth," Judge Whitman said with the patience of someone addressing a mentally disturbed child, "you've just been found guilty of fraud in my courtroom. I suggest you contact a criminal defense attorney rather than making additional public statements that could be used against you in federal prosecution." As federal marshals approached to discuss Bryce's immediate legal future, I realized that justice had been served not just for my family, but for every working family who'd ever faced corruption disguised as progress. The war was over, and the good guys had won. 1 week later, the headlines told the story better than I ever could. HOA president arrested at airport attempting flight to Cayman Islands. Federal marshals had caught Bryce at Lambert Airport with 2 suitcases full of cash and a one-way ticket to paradise. Turns out running a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme doesn't automatically make you smart enough to execute a clean getaway. The federal charges read like a greatest hits album of white-collar crime: embezzlement, fraud, racketeering, environmental destruction, and my personal favorite, conspiracy to defraud military families during active deployment. 14 other HOA officials across 5 counties got swept up in the investigation, proving that Bryce's operation was bigger than anyone had imagined. But the real victory was watching our community heal from the damage he'd inflicted. Margaret Henley became Willowbrook's new HOA president by unanimous vote, implementing the kind of transparent financial policies that should have existed from day one. Monthly homeowner meetings now included public budget reviews, contractor bid comparisons, and actual democracy instead of the suburban dictatorship Bryce had operated. The community garden we planted where his golf course clubhouse was supposed to be became a symbol of what neighborhoods could accomplish when people worked together instead of getting scammed by con artists in polo shirts. Every tomato plant and bean row represented families taking control of their own community instead of trusting it to predators. Calvin restructured the HOA's finances with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years untangling corporate messes. The agricultural preservation easement I'd signed protected my farm permanently while providing $3.8 million in conservation payments that funded complete restitution for every family Bryce had victimized. Insurance companies and asset forfeiture recovered an additional $1.2 million from his hidden accounts, ensuring nobody lost their life savings to his pyramid scheme. The smell of apple blossoms filled my grandfather's restored orchard as I walked property lines that were finally, legally, permanently mine. Cletus had helped me replant the trees destroyed during Bryce's midnight demolition, using heritage varieties that connected us back to the original plantings from the 1930s. Every new tree represented continuity that no suburban parasite could ever steal again. But the most important healing happened inside our farmhouse kitchen, rebuilt exactly where it had stood for 127 years. The original foundation stones that Bryce's bulldozers had scattered were carefully collected and reset, creating a memorial garden where my grandfather's hand-carved initials, JT 1934, were preserved under glass as a reminder that some things are worth fighting for. The legal precedent our case established rippled across Missouri and beyond. The state legislature passed the Thornfield Act, protecting military families from property seizure during deployment, with provisions requiring a 120-day notice and mandatory legal representation for any action affecting active duty service members' property rights. The state attorney general created a specialized HOA oversight division investigating community association financial crimes, with a hotline for homeowners to report suspicious board activities. Within 6 months, they'd opened investigations into 47 cases of suspected embezzlement and fraud across the state. Most importantly, our story inspired other families to fight back against similar scams. 23 agricultural properties stolen through Bryce's network were restored to their original owners through copycat legal strategies. The National Veterans Administration added property protection services to their deployment support programs, ensuring future military families wouldn't face the nightmare I'd endured. But the victory that meant the most was personal. Standing in my great-grandfather's apple orchard at sunset, reading a letter from a grateful Willowbrook homeowner whose family had avoided bankruptcy because of our coalition's work, I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to teach me about fighting for something bigger than yourself. Your sacrifice saved our home and our children's future, the letter read. We'll never forget that you chose to protect your neighbors instead of just seeking revenge. The annual Thornfield Heritage Festival became our way of celebrating agricultural preservation and community cooperation. Families from across 3 counties gathered each September to share food, music, and stories about standing up to corruption in their own communities. Local high school students received college scholarships funded by the conservation easement, ensuring rural kids could afford higher education without abandoning their agricultural roots. The Veterans Farm initiative we established helped military families start sustainable farming operations using land protection strategies I'd learned the hard way. Calvin managed the financial side while Margaret coordinated educational programs, creating a support network that ensured no veteran would face property theft alone. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch my great-grandfather built, watching cattle graze in pastures that would never be developed, listening to sounds that connected 4 generations of Thornfield farmers to the land that had shaped our character. Cletus would stop by most evenings, sharing coffee and conversation about crops, weather, and the satisfaction of knowing we'd beaten the bastards who'd tried to destroy everything our families had built. "You know what I learned from all this mess?" he said one evening, watching fireflies dance over fields that would remain agricultural forever. "What's that, Cletus?" "Sometimes the best way to save what you love is to share it with people who need it most." 3 months later, I got a call from a veteran in Arizona facing similar HOA land seizure. Margaret received requests to help reform corrupt community associations in Florida retirement communities. Our network of Thornfield-inspired property rights advocates was growing across America, proving that ordinary people could defeat corporate predators when they stopped fighting alone and started fighting smart. The next story was already beginning. They stole my neighbor's ranch, so we exposed their $50 million scam. But that's a tale for another day. Right now, I've got apple trees to tend and a community to protect. Speaking of protection, drop a comment sharing your worst HOA nightmare and let us know if you've ever had to fight corrupt community leadership. Your stories matter because they show other families they're not alone in these battles. And hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story about ordinary people taking down corrupt systems. Because justice isn't just served, it's earned by communities brave enough to fight for what's right. Sometimes the best revenge is building something better than what they tried to destroy. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win.
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.